day, my children, and welcome to our World War One topic video. And before we start, I'd like to make you aware that this is a content-heavy topic. Therefore, please lock in and let us focus. If you need to take a break, pause the video, grab some water, grab a snack, then we continue because there's a lot of content to be covered. Now, let's go to the introduction of World War One. Now, the first thing that you need to cover is what is war, right? So, according to these slides, a war is a state of violent armed conflict between countries or between competing forces within a country. Now, during the 20th century, two of the biggest and terrible wars in history took place. These were known as world wars because they spread or they involved a large number of countries spread across the world. Now, they were both long-term and immediate causes of the First World War, right? These included years of rivalry and tension between the powers of Europe. Each country was fighting for supremacy and control, leading to what? To the formation of the alliance system, which forced most countries into a world war. What was the cause of this tension between the powers of Europe? It is the urge to control. It is the urge to have power, especially looking back to how European countries wanted to take over parts of Africa. Long-term causes. Now, what were long-term causes? These long-term causes of World War I were the conflicts and tensions that had built up between the powers of Europe over the 40 years. There were four long-term causes which led to the outbreak of World War I in 1914. Now, these causes included nationalism, the growth of industrial economies, control of the seas, and European colonization and growth of European empires. Right? Now, this is in brief the long-term causes. Now, let us look at the notion of nationalism. Right? What is this nationalism? Now, nationalism is the belief that your country or nation, right, is better than other nations, right? So you have that superiority complex about your nation. In this sense, citizens felt so much pride and devotion for their nation that they felt that they were prepared to go to war and to die for their country, right? And for the intent of helping their country become a world power and to protect their achievements, right, as a country. Now, European countries obviously were competing to be the richest and powerful and strongest European nation by the end of the 19th century. Now, nationalism therefore caused the uprising in the Balkans because the people did not want to be ruled by a foreign nation, which was Austria-Hungary. Now, the Balkans War, right, of 1912 to 1913 increased the tension between the European powers because of the two groups which emerged in the Balkans, which were on the opposing side. Now, this map here basically makes us see where Austria-Hungary was situated, as well as a major empire that we're going to speak of in the next slide, which was referred to as the Ottoman Empire. Now, what we should take note of is that in the early 20th century, the Balkans was a very unstable area of Europe because the area had traditionally been controlled by the Ottoman or the Turkish Empire. However, by the start of the 20th century, the Ottoman Empire had weakened to such an extent that dissatisfied ethnic groups in the Balkans, such as the Serbs, were seeking independence because they could not be controlled by a weak nation. Right? Why then was the Balkans an area of a problem, or why were the Balkans a problem area. Now, the Ottomans were trying to keep their empire in Europe. The Slav people in Bosnia and, yeah, that word, were trying to set up independent countries and be free from Austria-Hungary. They wanted, therefore, to grow closer to their fellow Slavs in Serbia. This, therefore, became a reason for the assassination of the heir to the Austria-Hungarian throne and was a spark for World War I. Therefore, Austria-Hungary was trying to stop these Slavs countries being set up. Russia was, on the other hand, trying to encourage the Slavs to ensure it had a secure access to the Mediterranean. On the other side, Britain and France wanted to keep Russia out of the Mediterranean to protect their trade. Right? Now, we can then see that already there was an area of conflict because Russia was trying to what? To gain access to the Mediterranean. However, France and Britain wanted to keep Russia out of this area to protect their trading route. Now, moving on, we then look at another cause, which is industrial economies. We already have established on our previous videos the Industrial Revolution, what is industrial, right? Now, we should therefore remember that Britain and France had become wealthy through their control of the overseas trade, markets, territories, and people. The Industrial Revolution, right, had started in Britain and then spread to other parts of Europe. Now, this caused frustration for Germany, Austria-Hungary, Italy, and Russia as Britain was leading in being the richest country in Europe. And they also needed markets and raw materials, which was only limited to Britain and France, right? So Britain and France had a monopoly of what? Of raw materials. This therefore led to Germany to challenge Britain's economic dominance and started to produce more iron, coal, steel, and cars compared to Britain. Now then, this therefore caused what? Bitter rivalry and increased tension between the two countries, right? Which is Germany and Britain. Now, by the beginning of the 20th century, Britain no longer had the economic lead, right? And Germany therefore had caught up with Britain and was producing coal, iron, steel, and cars in a large number, right? Therefore, there was competition between now Britain and Germany. Now, we are looking at another cause, right, which was the control of the seas. What was the control of the seas? Now, this was the point of rivalry. The main rivalries in the control of the seas was Britain and Germany, because we should remember that Germany wanted to what? To control the Mediterranean. In order to build and keep a big empire, Britain and Germany had to have powerful navies. Britain had the powerful navy in the world, right? It used the navy to protect its coastline, its large overseas empire, and its trade routes across the world. Therefore, to challenge the control of the seas, the German Kaiser, which is a form of leader, right? A king in this sense, said he was going to build a great navy that could challenge the British Navy. In response to this, Britain made a formidable new warship called the Dreadnought, which radically changed and improved the power at sea. Now, the Dreadnought had an armored deck with fast-firing heavy guns. Germany responded to this challenge by trying to build even more superior warships. Now, this then was the beginning of what we call the naval race, because people were trying to build and arm themselves in the seas, right? Building a large warship or navy army, in which both sides tried to what? To build better and bigger navy. Right, now this is what we are looking at then when we speak of the control of the sea. Now, on this particular slide, briefly, we are looking at the British dreadnoughts, right, which were the warships that Britain had. Right? In brief, we won't dwell much on this because it is just a visual source of the warships at that time. Then moving on, we are then looking at the Germany warships also, right? And you can see that both of these countries actually had the aim of building bigger and better warships to defend the control that they had at sea. Now, moving on, we are going to look at empire. Now, let us look at the empires, right? Speaking about the British Empire, we already know that it was the largest as it contained a quarter of the human race and it was the richest, right, of them all. And now to protect her empire, because we refer to countries as a her. Now to protect her empire, Britain had what? Had to build a very large navy and obviously to control the trade. Secondly, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, right? Now this empire was ruled by an 84 years old emperor, which was Franz Joseph I. He ruled over nationalities like the Germans, Austrians, Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, and Serbs. Most of the world was in the hands of the Austrian-Hungarians. The other nationalities wanted to rule themselves. They wanted to be independent of this. Now, looking at the Russian Empire, this empire had more land and people than any other power. However, it was weak, right? Most of its people were poor and uneducated, and the empire was badly run by Tsar Nicholas II or Tsar Nicholas II. The people had no say, and a number joined the revolutionary groups to try and topple the system or Tsar Nicholas II. Now, moving on, we're looking at the Germany Empire, which was formed in 1871 and was ruled by Kaiser Wilhelm II. He had a strong army and big industries. Now, Germany was afraid that France would attack them and wanted a navy as strong as the British Navy. France, on the other hand, had a strong army and wanted to win back the two border areas, Alsace and Lorraine, which Germany had taken from them in 1871. Sorry if I mispronounced this particular word here. Now, let us move on then to the colonization and empire, right? Now, colonization and empires. European powers colonized many parts of the world in the late 19th century. Right? They did this by taking over more and more land in parts of the world, including Africa as a continent. Now, the nations of Europe became richer and therefore they strengthened their power over another. The European nations competed over who had the most colonies, especially in Africa. Now, both Britain and France had huge empires overseas, and the German Kaiser was envious, meaning that he had a sense of envy, right? He wanted whatever Britain and France had and wanted to have a bigger empire, but it started later than other empires in the race for colonies. So he was behind. He wanted to play catch up, right? So that he could meet their standard. In this sense, the competition between the powers led to a system of alliances where they agreed to defend each other if one of them was attacked. Right? Now, this was then the birth of alliances. Now, let us look at the alliance system. What we should know is that before 1914, Europe was divided into two armed camps. The Triple Entity, which comprised of Britain, France, and Russia, as well as the Triple Alliance, which comprised of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Right? And this here is a depiction of the when and the who was allied during these time frames. Then moving on, we then look at World War One alliances, right? The triple entity, which is depicted in blue, and the triple alliance, which is depicted in red, right? Then moving on, we are then going to be looking at what we call an immediate cause, right? This is a cause that starts the fire, right? Because there were already long-term causes, that tension being built up. However, an immediate cause is then needed to spark and to start up the flame and to obviously create the war and the conflict that is direct between the countries. Now, we are then looking at the immediate cause, which was the assassination of Archduke of Austria at Sarajevo, right? This is when Austria-Hungary competed with Serbia and Russia for territory and influence in the Balkans. The large Austrian-Hungarian Empire contained many different nationalities, right? This included millions of Slavs. Now, a secret terrorist group called the Black Hand was then formed in Serbia with the aim of freeing all the Slavs from Austrian rule. Now they decided to then assassinate the heir to the Austrian throne, which was Franz Ferdinand, on his visit to Sarajevo, the capital of Serbia. Right? Now this is an immediate cause. This is what was the tipping point, right? The start and the foundation, not the foundation in a sense that it was long term, but the immediate foundation that led to people saying enough is enough, now we're going to war, right? And then here, as you can see, this is a depiction of uh, Franz Ferdinand being what? Being assassinated, or him being already killed. And you can see that they were just riding in a chariot or a vehicle that was convertible, right? And this image also depicts to us the chaotic scene during his assassination. Moving on, we are then looking at what we call the Allied and Central Powers. Now, during this time, Austrian-Hungarian blamed the Serbian government for the assassination of the royal couple. They therefore demanded compensation or they would declare war. The Serbians could not meet the heavy demands, and so Austria-Hungary declared war, right? It then turned to a world war because of the alliance system. It was because countries were allies. It is because countries said to each other, if you go to war, I go to war because we help each other. We are buddies, we are best boombas, we are best friends. Therefore, why should I not help you? That is why it turned into a world war. Right now, alliances had been formed for economic reasons, right, during the scramble for colonies or during the scramble for Africa as a topic. But then when the armed race began, the alliance system then transformed and became a military alliance where they would help each other if one of them was attacked during this time. Now, the alliance system was a method of therefore them trying to keep the balance of power in Europe, right? That no country should overpower the other. Moving on, we're then looking at the Allied powers once again. When the Austrian-Hungary declared war on Serbia, Russia announced that they would help Serbia during this war. Russia wanted to be friendly with Serbia so that they could use Serbia as a trade route to the Mediterranean Sea, as we had previously covered. Now, Britain and France were in alliance with Russia, and so they also joined this war. Our country, which is South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, were British colonies, and so they joined the war to help their colonial master or their mother country, as we had covered in our previous video. Now, the USA was neutral in this situation until 1917, when Germany attacked the ship Lusitania, a passenger ship with submarine torpedoes. They too therefore joined the Allied powers. Now, let us look at this particular depiction here. Now, in this particular depiction, this is basically a depiction of the Allied system, how it worked, right? And if it says to us, if you touch him, then I'll do this. If you make a move, then I'll understand. Now, this then shows us that the countries were what? Were close. Therefore, if you did something to the other one would defend the one that you've done something to, understand? So they were like friends or best friends that defended each other through thick and thin, right? Then let us move on to the next slide. Okay, causes of World War One, right? Here briefly, this is a triple entity: Great Britain, France, and Russia. Triple alliance: Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Now, this looks at the Central Powers. Now, once Austria-Hungary had declared war, their alliance partners, Germany, Italy, and the Ottoman Empire, which is modern-day Turkey, said they would help Austria-Hungary. This is what we've covered already. Now, this looks at the joining of USA, right, during this war in 1917, where Lusitania sank by a submarine, probably 1,260 people dead, twice torpedoed off Irish coast, sinks in 15 minutes. Captain Turner saved Fordham and Vanderbilt missing. Washington believes that a grave crisis is at hand. Right now, this was during that time when the Lusitania was sunk, and therefore this was the headline of the New York Times. Now, this looks at the sinking of the Lusitania, the USA passenger ship. Right? As you can see, it was a disastrous event that caused the USA to be angry and therefore what? Joined the war. Now, what were the aspects of experiences in World War One? First of all, we are looking at the issue of conscription. Now, conscription looks at over 3 million men in Britain that had previously volunteered to serve in the army in the first 2 years of the war. Now, this had a devastating effect on British society, as women were therefore now compelled to take the jobs of men by working in the shops, factories, banks, government offices, and farms, just to name a few. Now, this therefore also changed the status of women who had never worked outside their home, right? They were previously housebound. They were doing chores, they were doing what was viewed as the work of a typical woman during this time. Now, Britain therefore suffered heavy losses in the trenches on the Western Front, and they therefore needed or ended up introducing conscription in 1916 when they saw that the war was not going to end quickly as they had predicted, right? Now, what were the requirements of forcing of conscription, right? The requirements for conscription was that all single and married men from the age of 18 to 41 had to join the war. If you fell in this age group, you had to join what? The war. Now, this age was later changed and increased to 51. If you were a man and you were 51 years of age or younger than 51, you had to. You were compelled to what? To join the war because you were a man. Those that could not be conscripted, however, were men who had children and whose wives were unfortunately dead. It was the ministers of religion, and it was if in a case where 6 sons were in the army, the seventh son could stay at home. And if your work was of national importance, if you were deemed medically unfit, or if you were a business or a domestic hardship worker, and if you were a conscientious objector, right? Now, conscientious objectors, these were men who refused to fight or kill anyone because they believed it was wrong. Now, these were people that were not conscripted to what? To join. Now, major key factor in the war was what we call propaganda. Now, propaganda was used to what? To try and stir up emotions and anger and hate of the people against the enemy through newspaper and posters. Right? In this sense, propaganda was basically false information where the aim was to what? To make people angry and for them to hate the enemy so that they could join the war. Now, the aim of propaganda was to make people feel so strongly about their country that they were willing to die in an effort to save their country from the terrible enemy. The government, therefore, would report that the enemy suffered heavy losses, but they would not report how much they suffered. Right? So, in this sense, they then said, our enemy is being defeated, but we also still need you to join. Right? And there was a press censorship where most of the information was controlled by the government. Right? Certain things would be publicized to the people, but certain things and valid things would not be shown in public because that would what that would change the idea that people had about the war and the control that the country had. Now, in this sense, all the best writers in Britain were secretly put to work on propaganda posters and pamphlets that were encouraging men to join the army. Men were needed in the army, therefore men had to be what? Encouraged to join. Now, these are some of the posters that were used as propaganda posters. Destroy this mad brute, enlist. Who's absent? Is it you instead? So now they used the word you to what? To tap into the emotions of the people, especially the men, so that they could form what? Form part of the war efforts or to be part of the soldiers because they are absent, therefore they are needed. Next up, we also look at this famous propaganda poster that looks at this way. It says, Britons wants you. Join your country's army. God save the king. Women of Britain say go. Right. Now, this also appeals to how the women were used and they were said that they agree to send their men to war so that the men could defend the country. Moving on, we are also looking at this other poster where it says, I want you for the US Army, right? Remember Belgium, enlist today, right? These are some of the what? The propaganda posters that were used during this time. Now, let us move on and look at conscientious objectors in detail. Now, about 16,000 British men were conscientious objectors, or what we can call pacifists, right, who believed that the killing of another human being was wrong. It was wrong to kill another human being, regardless of why you are killing them, right? 7,000 of these men agreed to help in the army as long as they did not have to kill anyone. Now, this meant that as long as they did not hold the gun in their hand and pull the trigger, they were going to join the war. Now, they did jobs like cooking, driving vehicles, digging toilets, digging the trenches, and helping in the hospitals. However, regardless of the fact that they were not at the front lines, many of them still lost their lives as stretch bearers on the front lines because they would help the soldiers that were wounded or the soldiers that had passed on the front lines and carry them away. Now, in this sense, they were unfortunately short. Now, about 3,000 of these men were sent to special camps and 6,000 were sent to prison, where 69 of them passed away or died. Moving on, we are then coming to the core of the war, right? The life of a soldier, the life in the trench or the life in the trenches. Now, what we should discover or should take note of is that trenches were dug in the Western Front to be used for fighting the war. Altogether, 9,600 kilometers of trenches were dug where soldiers had a timetable for fighting. Right? Now, the soldiers usually had 4 days on the front line, 4 days in the support trenches, making food for the front line, then 4 days reserve, and 14 days rest. Now, in this sense, when there was a battle, they would have no rest. 24/7, they would what? Fight 24 hours, day in, day night, for the time frame of them having a battle. Now, in this sense, in between the trenches, there was what we call no man's land, right? Which was usually covered with barbed wire. The soldiers dreaded the command where they were told to say they should go over the top, right? Because when the command would be over the top, now in this sense, they had to jump out of the trench and run straight into enemy fire over no man's land. In this sense, they had to expose themselves and then they would suffer because they would be exposed and they would be shot at by the enemy, right? Now, this depiction is basically showing us how a trench would be structured. I will not dwell on this, but as you can see, this is the depth, this is the dugout, and this is a soldier. And as you can see, the soldier is not exposed to this part because that's where a bullet would be fired. And then here, as you can see, now this is how a typical trench looked like during this time. As you can see, it is not a hygienic condition. It is clustered. There are many men who are obviously not, in a sense, clean because they are there for days and they are in water, they are muddy and they are sweaty and all of those things. Now moving on here, and you can see this is another image that shows us the life in the trench, right? And as you can see, there is a decoy here. This is what we call a decoy, where they would show this decoy over, and if this decoy is short, then they would see that actually it is not safe for us to expose ourselves. Now, this is no man's land, and as we said, it was covered by barbed wire or with barbed wire. Then moving on. Now, what we should establish is that life in the trenches was boring, right? It was boring, it was dreadful, and it was dangerous. The soldiers had to make sure that they never lifted their heads above the top of the trench, as an enemy sniper could kill them. Therefore, they depended on the decoy that I showed you previously. Now, during the day, they had many chores to do, like sentry duty, weapon cleaning, trench maintenance, refilling sandbags, emptying toilets, fetching supplies and ammunition from back trenches. All the time, they were wondering when the next enemy shell would explode in the trenches. In the 4 years of this kind of war, very few success was achieved. No one actually succeeded, or no one actually had major success in acquiring land over no man's land. Now, towards the end of the war, the tank was a new invention that helped to go through the enemy lines. Now, it was by the help of the tank that they were now succeeding in going through and actually taking over the enemy's side. Now, let us look at the problems in which these soldiers unfortunately faced in the trenches. Now, the soldiers had little sleep because obviously during a war, you cannot just go to bed as you would for 8 hours, 10 hours, and so forth, because that was unrealistic. Now, they also did not have a proper chance to wash. Therefore, there was lice, nits, flies, huge rats, frogs, and horned beetles at their environment. Now, diseases such as cholera, dysentery, typhus, pneumonia, bronchitis were easily spread amongst them. And they had what we call trench foot, which was a fungal infection from damp feet. Remember, during seasonal changes, be it winter, summer, and so forth, they were there, right? And therefore, if it rained, they had to still continue fighting, and their feet were unfortunately exposed to what? To the damp soil or to the mud. Now, the temperatures there were at times freezing, right? And there was a smell of dead bodies, overflowing toilets, and rotting rotting sandbags, right? Because remember, during this time, there was no time for them to say, rest in peace, dear friend, let us bury you. Instead, the bodies were piled up so that at the end, they would be taken back to their respective what? Families. Now, they also suffered from a poisonous gas, right? Which was referred to as mustard gas. Now, as you can see here, this was a major cause to them having that fungal foot infection, which we call what? Which we call trench foot or trench feet. Now, moving on, we are then looking at soldiers who had, yeah, they had rats, and obviously due to food shortage, they would at times consume these delicacies, as I would call them, right? And then here you can see that the soldiers are trying to help each other, right? They're trying to massage each other, they're trying to treat each other's trench foot because obviously it was getting severe. And by the end of the day, if they did not help each other, then they would lose that entire foot. Moving on, as you can see, and I'm sorry for those that are sensitive, but this has to be shown for the sake of us knowing how trench foot looks like. Now, as you can see, the foot would become like this, right? Due to the exposure of damp weather conditions, freezing, and so forth. And this is how it looked. Now, let us move on. This is a soldier that is wearing a mask, and this soldier is trying to what? To help himself not get affected by the poisonous gas of which we spoke of, which is the mustard gas. Now, here we are looking at the concept of food. The soldiers ate bully beef, they ate bread, biscuits, and tinned Irish stew. Now, a real treat for them was bacon, cheese, and jam. Now, this meant that this was their Christmas. This was when they would actually have the luxury of bacon, of cheese, and jam. But apart from that, they had to what? To eat staple food, normal food that they were used to. In summer, they were given a ration of lime juice, and in winter, they were given some rum, which is a form of alcohol that is used during cold weathers to what? To keep your body warm. Right? Now let us move on to how did these soldiers entertain themselves, right? Now, music is a form of expression, a way that we as humans use to escape terrible conditions and a means of lifting one's spirits during difficult times. Now, in World War One, music and poetry was used, right? During this time, many songs were composed which expressed what the soldiers were feeling, right? And obviously, during this time, you know that the soldiers were scared, they were dreading, they were uncomfortable, they were cold, and so forth. Now, the songs brought unity to the men as they marched on, or as they marched during this time, and as they waited in boring and dangerous situations, right? Now they would compose songs together so that they would lift each other's spirits up in a space where they felt that their spirits were dying. Now let us move on and look at World War One and South Africa. It is important that when we cover history, we contextualize according to our current context, to our country, because it affected us as South Africans as well. Right? Now, South Africa, or we, were a British colony during this time. Therefore, it was her duty, whose duty? South Africa's duty, to help Britain in the war because Britain was the mother country. Now, many of the Afrikaners, right, during this time were bitter towards the British because of the loss of 28,000 Boer women and children in the concentration camps in 1902 during the South African War or the Anglo-Boer War. Now, in 1914, some Afrikaners had a rebellion against the South African government because they refused to help Britain in the war because Britain had exposed their women and children to concentration camps where many of them passed away. Now, it took 3 months for the government to stop this rebellion. In this sense, South Africans were therefore used in the war against the Germans in Southwest Africa, Namibia, to defend the British naval base at Simonstown near Cape Town and to fight in Europe. Now, this is then the naval base and this is in Simonstown. Okay, now we are then moving on to one of the battles. Now we are looking at what we call the sinking of the SS Mandy in 1917. Again, 83,000 black South Africans volunteered to help during the war. Why do you think they volunteered? I'll leave that up to you. Now, they were not allowed to fight, but they did other jobs such as digging trenches, cooking, and cleaning the hospitals. In 1917, a group of 823 black volunteers were put on a British steamship called the SS Mandy in Cape Town. Most of them were Mpondos from the rural areas of Eastern Cape, Amampondo people, right? They had never been on a ship before. Just off the Isle of Wight, an empty British meat ship, the SS Darrow, crashed into the Mandy in heavy fog. Some of the people on board were killed outright as the SS Mandy was cut in half. Others drowned, trapped below. Most of the men could not swim, unfortunately. 607 of these black South Africans, right, and 9 white South Africans and 30 British crew members went to a watery grave. Now, in this sense, that means that they passed away, unfortunately, and their grave was the water. Now, oral history therefore records that Reverend Isaac Joba urged the men to die as brothers, and they could be proud of themselves as sons of Africa. Right? Now they died in unity, holding each other as brothers. Right? This is according to oral history. Now let us move on then, and this is basically the SS Mandy sinking. These are the men, as you can see, they are black men there, right? And this was the ship before it actually sunk. Now let us move on and look at the role of which women played, right, in this war. Now, women in Britain during World War I. Before 1914, very few women did paid work like nursing and teaching as well as domestic servants, but the middle and upper class women did not consider it proper to work. Now, this attitude of not working, however, changed during the war, as the women were now needed to work in the jobs left by men when they went to war. Right? When the men went to war, women therefore needed to start working. In the army, they needed cooks, storekeepers, ambulance drivers, and nurses. Now, in the government, they needed 200,000 clerks and telephonists, in which we call receptionists. In private offices, 500,000 clerks were needed. On the farms, 250,000 were needed to grow food. Munitions factories, 700,000 for making shells and other weapons. Now, some of them were needed to upload coal on the docks and for building strips. In transport, they needed conductors on buses and trains. Right? Now, these are some of the roles that women had to play. In this sense, by 1918, 4 million or 4,800,000 women approximately were employed, right? Now, these women were the unsung heroes of the war. What does this mean? This means that they were never recognized, right? These 4.8 women were never recognized after the war, right? However, their efforts were as follows. These women kept the industrial wheels of the country turning, and this became known as keeping the home flames burning, right? Their home being Britain. They worked cheerfully for low wages, and the old accepted fashions for women changed as they then started to wear short hair instead of long hair because long hair was dangerous in the factories. For the first time, women wore trousers because it was easier for them to load coal, as dresses were shorter because there was a material shortage as a result of the war. Right now, this material obviously was used to what to produce uniform for the soldiers. Therefore, the shortage. Now, they were comfortable, or comfortable underwear replaced very tight corsets that women were previously expected to wear. Women also smoked and drank in public for the first time, and they also rode on the back of motorbikes. Now, despite all the work the women did, they were not treated as equals to men, and they were the unsung heroes. Now, here, as you can see, this is the revolution of women in terms of the way they had dressed. Previously, they would typically dress like this. However, now their new role made them dress like this. Right, one, two, and three. Then let's move on. Now you can see here these are women and they are going to work. As you can see here, this image shows women as being happy as they now had a form of freedom or a sense of freedom, right? And independence and a purpose, unlike them being housebound. This is another depiction, right? How they previously looked to how they looked during the time when men were away, right? Now, we are coming towards the end of World War One, right? By looking at the defeat of Germany. Now, in this sense, we already covered the fact that the USA joined the war in 1917, in particular April 17th, right? Bringing in fresh troops and new supplies that then resulted in the defeat of Germany. Now, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated, right, which means that he gave up power and then he fled to the Netherlands. Now, peace was then officially declared at 11 o'clock at the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918. That means at 11 o'clock, 11th of November, which was yesterday, on the 11th month, right? After 4 bloody years of bitter fighting, and this meant that the Great War was over. All over the world, people celebrated the end of the war by dancing in the streets, drinking champagne, right? And in this sense, they were rejoicing and showing that they have suffered greatly. However, they are glad that this bloody war has finally ended. However, unfortunately, this meant that returning to normal lives was difficult because during this time of war, towns, homes, and fields were destroyed. Now, the total number of deaths or dead people or casualties was about 16.5 million, right? And families and countries had to look after about 21 million wounded soldiers who could do little work, right? They were wounded, therefore they could not do anything, especially in their households or for the economy of the country. Now, here, this is a newspaper article published at that time where it says the US officially at war, right? This speaks to the joining of USA in the war. Now, let us move on here. Now, we are looking at what is deemed the Treaty of Versailles, right? Now, in January 1919, 70 delegates from 27 countries met at the beautiful palace of or outside Paris to discuss what was going to happen to the defeated nations. Now, the negotiations, right, for the treaty went on for 6 months because the big three, which was USA, Britain, and France, could not come to an agreement about the conditions set down for Germany. Britain therefore wanted to restore trade with Germany and get reparations, right? Their main focal point was restoring trade and also getting reparations. The USA just wanted to restore the trade with Germany, but with no reparations. France, on the other side, wanted harsh conditions on Germany with huge reparations. Now, these three factors speak to how much damage each country had suffered. Obviously, Britain suffered some casualties and some damage. USA had few casualties to no casualties because they joined the war later and they were fresh and ready for the war because they were sitting it out all along. However, France had much damage to it because remember, the front lines were also in France. Therefore, its state was harsh, right? Its conditions, right, as a country were also harsh. Hence, they wanted what? Harsh conditions on Germany with huge reparations. Reparations meaning money from what? From this country, which is Germany. Now, finally, allies signed the peace treaty of Versailles on the 28th of June, exactly 5 years after Archduke Franz Ferdinand had been assassinated. Right. Then let us move on, and then we're going to look at in detail the terms of this treaty. Right. How were the conditions and what was expected? Now, in this sense, the terms of the treaty are as follows. There were 440 articles on what Germany had to do. Firstly, which was to pay reparations, which was an impossible sum of money because also Germany had been involved in the war, therefore it was broke in a sense. It had no money. Germany had to accept responsibility for the war, right? Their troops were then limited to what? 200,000 only for the entire country. They could not have any tanks, warships, or submarines. And a republic was formed instead of the monarchy. Remember, Kaiser Wilhelm abdicated the throne. Now, Germany lost territory and colonies, especially in Africa. Now, the deputy minister, right, of South Africa, which was Jan Smuts, was the only one or the only person in the world to sign the peace treaty for both world wars. However, he did make a comment that the Treaty of Versailles was a harsh treaty for the Germans and predicted that the Germans would resent it And obviously that would lead to what? To World War II, where we look at the rise of Adolf Hitler. Now, in this sense, in 1939, World War II broke out because Germany wanted to restore what the Treaty of Versailles had taken away from them, most importantly being the dignity that it had lost due to these terms. Right. Now let us move on, and briefly you can see that these are the member states that were part of the peace treaty of Versailles. Right, I won't dwell much on this, and as we can see, this is a depiction. And mind you, I always say depiction because these are not the actual images of the people, but paintings that depict those people, right? And it is important for us to say that in history. Now here, this is a newspaper article published at that time, right, that speaks of the treaty being signed and the war being over. Wilson leaves Paris, sails Sunday, Germans pledge to act in good faith, right? Then here, this is a depiction of the enormous or the huge amount of reparations that the Germans had to pay, right? And then these are the terms. The terms being German people must pay for all damage to civilians on land, or sea, or the air, right? So they had to obtain and to pay back for all the damage that they had caused for all intents and purposes. Then finally, we are then looking at another depiction that basically looks at what the big four pills worth millions a box, right? Now, this is a depiction of Germany being fed the peace terms, right? And as you can see here, this hand depicts the stronghold which the British Empire, France, America, Italy, Japan had on Germany, and how they were being forced to accept and to swallow the pill of the peace terms. Now, this then also looks at how even if they liked this pill or not, they still needed to what? To swallow, even though it was very bitter. Okay, now this concludes our topic for World War One. And apologies that it is too long, but we had to cover this topic in depth so that we can have an understanding of how World War One was and all the nitty-gritties about World War One. I hope this video was informative, and I hope that you will take into account the aspects that shaped World War One, the causes of World War One, and the conditions of the soldiers, as well as the role that the women played. And lastly, we are going to look at, or we have looked at, how Germany was defeated and the terms of the peace treaty they had to accept as a nation. And finally, which led to World War One, where they wanted to fight against the dignity that was stripped from them. Thank you very much for tuning in, and I hope you will enjoy this video. And I hope that you are studying and you are locking in for these exams and for your test. Thank you very much. I am Mr. Maibong Gwenya. Goodbye.